True liberation for Indigenous people cannot manifest under the conditions that are placed upon us by the capitalist and colonial systems. Any attempt through protests or grassroots movements either become recuperated, vilified through media, or spied on and taken down through direct and violent RCMP or military intervention. Glenn Coulthard summarizes my paper perfectly. Our efforts to decolonize must directly confront more than just economic relations. They must account for the complex ways that capitalism, patriarchy, white supremacy, and the state interact with one another to form the constellation of power relations that sustain colonial patterns of behavior, structures, and relationships. These power relations all play a part and weave together in their oppression of the Mohawk Nation during the Oka Crisis, of the Wet'suwet'en Nation and their protests of oil pipelines, and of Cindy Blackstock and her advocacy of children and family welfare. I believe that Indigenous people and many other groups will not see a better world as long as these colonial and capitalist systems are allowed to operate with supreme power. We have to continuously analyze and deconstruct exactly how these systems abuse their power in order to maintain it. I remember when I was just starting college, and for every Indigenous, Canadian, or global issue, I would question why. Why do these things happen, and for what? It didn't take long to notice a pattern that it always led back to the capitalists, the rich and wealthy. So I hope through this, I can help transform Indigenous, Canadian, or global issues from surface level and isolated incidents into an interconnected power web of deliberate oppression. At Oka, there is an estimated 4,000 Army personnel, which was an equal amount compared to how many were deployed in Kuwait during the Gulf War that same year. It's ironic that Canada felt the same force was necessary for an invasion of land in Kuwait, which was far deadlier compared to the Oka Crisis, which was about preventing Canadian invasion and didn't even come close to comparable harm. The Mohawk land that was in dispute was an Indigenous burial site, and the government intended to replace it with a golf course, which would only serve the rich as well as waste tons of water and pesticides that would leak into the surrounding environment. It was more than that though. It was an ecological concern in a general sense. Then it became a case of self-preservation in the fight for Indigenous sovereignty. In protecting their own land and culture, the Mohawk people were labeled as terrorists by the state and Canadians alike. Canadian politician at the time, Jacques Parizeau, said, "There's a crisis in Oka just like there's a crisis in Iraq," and even called on Quebec Premier to cease negotiations with terrorists. The Canadian Police Association also paid for advertisements in newspapers with the message, "We oppose terrorism." The media controlled the narrative by focusing on the perceived violence of the Mohawk people instead of the true underlying issues of Indigenous sovereignty. What followed was further violence towards the Mohawk people, not from the government, but from the citizens of Quebec as well. One incident includes a mob going store to store, telling the owners to not let Indigenous people buy their products. Many of the owners complied because they were also threatened that if they didn't, the mob would destroy their property. That same mob would later surround, threaten, and attack Indigenous people in their cars as they were trying to drive home. 2 non-Indigenous people tried to calm down the mob, but one woman was attacked, and the other person was detained by the police for trying to defend the woman. The mob, which threatened stores and attacked Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, claimed that they are not racists. We're just angry at a militant warrior society. The warriors are terrorists. Another incident on Highway 20 shows a violent mob of Quebec citizens as they tossed rocks and bricks at 75 cars full of Indigenous women, children, and elders trying to escape what they believed would be a full-scale invasion of their land by the military. Many were injured from the thrown objects and the glass windows that were shattered, as the police stood by and did nothing. An elder would eventually die a day later due to chest trauma and injuries causing a heart attack. These incidents were purposely incited from the government and its politicians, from the capitalist propaganda media, and from the RCMP because of their position of labeling the Mohawk people as terrorists. The Wet'suwet'en Nation has faced a combination of oppression from supposed Indigenous allies in office, both the Liberal Party and NDP, as well as violent militarized invasion of land and destruction of property. After a decade of protesting, journalists and dozens of peaceful land protectors were arrested and Wet'suwet'en territory and buildings have been destroyed. The RCMP and companies such as TC Energy and LNG Canada have been in constant contact, and the companies have even urged RCMP to remove and arrest protesters. According to Associate Professor Jeffrey Monahan, police do not have to enforce these injunctions. The police are choosing to enforce these injunctions, and those decisions are very closely aligned with the interests of the companies. So, what we are seeing in Wet'suwet'en territory is the government, multi-billion-dollar energy companies, and the RCMP come together to invade and genocide indigenous land, all in the name of oil and money. All of this is based on the capitalist system's need for constant growth. Every year and every quarter, profits and stock prices must go up. A company making $500 million a year in profit will not be content if that profit margin doesn't increase to $600 million in a year. A company that doesn't see constant growth will be seen as a failure and will be eaten up by smarter or more ruthless businesses. There's a lot of problems with this, which I'll quickly go through. First of all, the profits do not benefit the working class citizen. It instead goes to someone who already has millions or billions. Nor does the system benefit the consumer or the average person in the world. Because in order to increase profits, the business will have to underfund, decrease pay, overwork, or fire the worker while cutting benefits and increasing automation. They will also cut corners on their services or products, use cheaper materials, charge more while decreasing and shrinking services or products, ship work overseas so they can exploit international work laws by employing children and subject them to unsafe conditions, racial and gender discrimination, and forced overtime. These companies will also need to expand production, which means they will need to increase mining, farming, logging, and oil operations. This practice, which can be described as neoliberal policies or austerity politics, happens in education, healthcare, government organizations, and everywhere else. And once again, this whole economic system is based on endless growth. But the problem with that is, our planet is a finite resource. If we continue under capitalism, one day there won't be anything left to extract. This is very important to understand when bringing it back to indigenous issues, especially regarding land and resources. Although this could easily be summed up as old white man bad, this leaves out the understanding that they're just playing the game as it was meant to be played, and they will never stop. They'll never stop invading or exploiting our land and our people. It is a system in which crises and catastrophe are not only constant, but rather they are inherent and complicit with the system. Oil companies covered up climate change for over 40 years. They lied and paid the media to keep it out of the mainstream discourse, and now that it is uncovered, they further misinform the public through the media and ideas they fund. They have been the biggest funders and pushers of the individual carbon footprints, as well as the idea of recycling, both of which don't actually do anything to mitigate the climate crisis. All this does is put the responsibility of our planet dying on whether or not you recycle your bottle, whether you turn off your lights or take the stairs instead of the elevator. But the ruling class doesn't face any repercussions for the 90 to 100 million barrels of oil extracted every single day worldwide. There's no repercussions for the wars and millions of soldiers that died in the name of their country and democracy. There's hardly any repercussions for the spills and hazards that they cause to the environment. And it is the government that allows these oil tyrants to operate with impunity because their pockets get filled with blood and oil money. So violence against indigenous people and their land is just a necessity for the system to continue hoarding their wealth. The final thing I want to say on this is, we help fund these operations through our taxes that go into increasing RCMP budgets and to support big corporations through tax exemptions, subsidies, and bailouts. It was just announced recently that the RCMP will receive an additional $230 million from the BC provincial government. LNG Canada, who's trying to get a pipeline through Wet'suwet'en territory, received $275 million in public funds. TC Energy, who's also trying to get a pipeline through Wet'suwet'en territory, received a pledge for $7.5 billion, but the deal fell through, for which Canadians still had to pay $1.3 billion for. TC Energy also owns the Keystone Pipeline, which recently just had a massive spill and is now the largest oil leak in the US since 2010. It also had other significant leaks in the past few years, and all these crises and catastrophes will be paid for by the people. and more lands will continue to be invaded and destroyed because, once again, the driving motive of capitalism is infinite growth. The point is, our own taxes and our own money will go to oil billionaires. Also, they can destroy our land and flood it with oil spills and other catastrophes. And taxation, under capitalism, is just a method of redistributing wealth upwards. Cindy Blackstock is a model citizen and highly educated with no criminal record. Yet even she is not exempt from government oppression. She is an advocate for Indigenous child and family welfare, yet she was illegally spied on, followed, and documented by over 189 individuals because the Canadian Security Intelligence Service believed she was a threat to national security. The government's own documents state that the purpose of their spying was to try find other motives for a child welfare case that Cindy had just filed against the government. They spent over $3 million trying to derail the case, and even withheld thousands of documents from the Human Rights Tribunal. Nothing has really seemed to come out of the case with Cindy, and she says, "The bottom line is that I have no reasonable assurance that the surveillance is not continuing." The message Canada is trying to get across is that they don't have the funds or resources to help with housing, water, and basic necessities, but they do have the funds and resources to spy on Indigenous people. According to Pearl, the purpose of government surveillance is due to fears of Indigenous resistance to colonial projects that challenge non-Indigenous peoples' knowledge and understandings of land, capitalism, and governance. And I can guarantee that there are many others besides Cindy who are also being spied on. This final example is vital and very important to understand. Cindy Blackstock is a perfect example of being a good citizen and organizing what the general public would call the right way to protest, yet she is still being discriminated against by the government and its officials because of her power and ability to challenge the state. The government, media, and citizens of Canada all have critiques and problems with the product examples I've showed here. They've had problems with the Oka Crisis and how the Indigenous people protected their land. And they've had problems with how the Wet'suwet'en people protected their land because it doesn't fit their idea of a proper protest or what is right. And this happens all the time. You might hear or see people online saying, "Well, I support their cause, just not how they're protesting." Now, this idea is complex, but it can help be explained through a term called cultural hegemony. It was coined by a Marxist philosopher and political scientist named Antonio Gramsci, and explores how the ruling class not only dominates society through physical means like state violence or coercion, but also through an ideological sense of morals, values, norms, and behaviors. These ideas become enforced through education systems, workplaces, and form a shared common sense of the people. But these ideas are not there to benefit the people, rather they are only there to reflect the morals and values of the ruling class. A basic example is through movies and TV shows. Many war films end up creating a surge of people joining the military because in those films, it's glorified to fight for your country. So rhetorical question, who does that benefit when you brainwash millions of young and often poor or uneducated people to go to war? Now to bring this idea back, protests in North America therefore receive constant criticism and opposition for not fitting into a strict model of how to protest. You can protest, just don't be too loud. Just do it where we can't see you. Just don't disrupt the system's efficiency and constant need to make profit. And you can protest, but sometimes you need a permit to protest. All of this is absurd when you really think about it, because a protest is supposed to be loud. It's supposed to get people's attention, and it's supposed to disrupt the system. Once again, these are just the morals and values that the ruling class indoctrinates into the common citizen. But even if they think that the Oka Crisis or the Wet'suwet'en Nation had their problems, they still discriminate against Cindy Blackstock, who did it the right way. That's because from the capitalist and government's point of view, there is no right way for protesting. I believe there needs to be an understanding that the state of Canada will never give up its power if we continue to simply ask for equality and justice. Not only does the state and the capitalist system hoard its wealth and resources, crush opposition with RCMP and military, create and maintain institutional class and racial inequalities, but it controls the cultural hegemony of the people as well. We also need to understand that nobody in history has ever gotten their freedom by appealing to the moral sense of the people who were oppressing them. Indigenous people have been asking and protesting for decades, but some of our communities still don't have clean drinking water. Our lands are still being destroyed for oil pipelines or logging industries. All of our communities and organizations are incredibly underfunded, and our kids are still being ripped away from our families. If we're protesting invasion, resource extraction, land exploitation, racial and sexual violence, and that act gets labeled as terrorists out to destroy national security and social stability, then what is it that this country represents, and why are we trying to appeal to the morals and values? How can we try to advocate for healthier and safer futures when the government itself, along with big corporations, are actively determined in preventing and violently destroying our movements? You can't reform a system like this. There's no political party that doesn't serve the ruling class. And despite the media always trying to downplay global and indigenous issues, these are not isolated incidents. Our oppression is purposeful and deliberate in its violence. It is connected from education to the workplace, to the government, to the RCMP and military, and to the capitalists. Profit will always be the end goal at the expense of the people. But things didn't always happen this way, and it doesn't have to. In order to truly advocate for change, we need to understand how these systems will try to suppress or neutralize indigenous movements. Because no matter what our approach is, no matter what our intention is, the government and the capitalists will do everything in their power to suppress indigenous resurgence. If their perception of our existence and ideologies lead to our oppression, then together, we have a responsibility to continue challenging the colonial and capitalist systems that have initiated the struggle.